How's it going, everyone? In this video, what we're going to look at is whether there was a hidden red wave in the 2022 Senate elections in the United States. In 2022, right, in early November, there was the Senate elections, the House elections, the midterm elections in the United States. I'm not going to explain how the election works in this video. I have a separate video on that, and I'll put a link to that in the description. What we're discussing in this video is whether that election, specifically the Senate elections, had a hidden red wave. And here's what I mean by that. Leading up to the election, there were a lot of predictions that there's going to be a red wave, meaning a strong increase in support for the Republican Party, right? Red is the color of the Republican Party, so people called it a red wave. And after the election happened, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what happened? Where did the red wave go? Did it occur? Did it not occur? When it came to the elections in the House, Republicans did gain control of the House. They were losing the House before the election by a little bit, and they gained control of it by a little bit. So there was a victory. But what happened in the Senate was the Republicans did not have control of the Senate. The Senate was split 50-50. Tiebreaker was the vice president, which was the Democrat side. And after the election, it became also approximately 50-50, depending on the Georgia runoff. It might be 49-51 or remain 50-50. And that led to a debate. So is this a red wave or not? Well, it's not a victory, so that supports the side that no, a red wave did not occur. On the other hand, there were more Republican seats up for election than Democrat seats in the Senate, so it was a more uphill battle for the Republicans. And the fact that they managed to keep it at approximately 50-50, some people say, oh, that's a sign of a great success, so maybe that is an accomplishment for the Republicans. But here's what I mean by a red wave that's hidden. Okay, so let's say there's some state, and right, there's a Democratic and Republican Party, and in the previous election, okay, so in the previous election, let's say the Democratic candidate had 80% support and the Republican had 20% support, right? 80% of the vote, 20% of the vote. And in the most recent election, let's say the Democrat got 55% and the Republican got 45%. So support for the Republicans tremendously increased in this hypothetical situation, but they still lost the seat. Okay, so you wouldn't see that result in terms of who wins what seat, what the distribution of Senate seats is, but it is a significant increase in Republican support. Okay, alternatively, let's say there was a state where in the previous election, the Democrats had 45% of the vote and the Republicans had 55%. Okay, so Republicans were winning it before, and in the new election, now the Democrats have 20% of the vote and Republicans have 80%. So again, that will not change the result. Republicans held the seat before, they still hold the seat now in this hypothetical situation, but support for Republicans, again, tremendously increased. Okay, from 55% to 80%. So that's what we're going to look at here. Was there a hidden red wave, right? There was no obvious red wave, but was there a hidden one where maybe there was a substantial increase in support for Republicans, but it didn't translate into an increase in number of seats controlled? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at here. Okay, and there's a lot of numbers here, so let me lead you through this. Okay, so here we have the states where an election was held for the Senate in 2022. And right here we have the percentage of votes that went to the Republicans. Okay, in this column right here. What we have in this column here is the percentage of votes that went to the Republicans the last time that state had an election for a Senate seat, which would have been in either 2020 or 2018. Okay, so by looking at the difference between these two, all right, we can determine what was the what was the increase in Republican support. okay, in that particular state. And that's the difference right here. Okay, this is the difference right here, right? So this number here, it's Republican support in the most recent 2022 election minus the Republican support in whatever the previous election was for a Senate seat in that state. Okay, so if this number is positive, that means that Republican support or support for Republicans increased in that state in terms of Senate elections. And if this number is negative, it means that support for Republicans actually decreased. All right. This column here, that's just the same as the previous elections results, whatever election was there before 2022. It was just convenient for the spreadsheet to have those numbers twice. Okay, so that's the difference here. All right, so anytime the difference was positive, I highlighted it red, or like a pinkish red. Okay, so we can see that for most of the states, percentage of support for Republicans really did increase, right? Almost all of these numbers are red. And the number shows by how much did the support for Republicans increase. So here by 6.7%. Here, Alaska and California are highlighted gray. I'll get into those a little bit later, right? You have big numbers here, 33%, 40%, 3%, 7, 8%, right? So you see those numbers there, okay? In total, there were 34 states where elections were held. In 27 of those 34, we see an increase in support for Republicans compared to the previous Senate election there. And in only 7 of those 34 do we see a decrease. Percent-wise, in 79.4% of the states, approximately 80% of the states where an election was held, support for Republicans increased. And in about 20%, 21%, it decreased. Okay, now some notes here when dealing with Oklahoma. Okay, we're actually taking the average of the special and regular election results for 2022 to get that number right there, that 63.05. And when looking at Georgia, we're looking at the first round because we're not looking at the runoff, just the first round election results for 2022. And for 2020, that's the previous election, we're actually taking the average of the regular and special election there to get the 2020 number. Okay, so that's one way we could look at this data and say, okay, so for almost all of the states, there was an increase in support for Republicans. We can also look at the average change in support for Republicans, right? So that's the average of all of these differences. And it comes to 4.8, right? So on average over all these states where there was an election for the Senate in 2022, on average Republican support increased by 4.8%. Another way we could look at the data is this chart right here. Okay, so what we have on the horizontal axis, this is percentage of the vote that went to Republicans in the previous election. Okay, so either 2020 or 2018. Okay, and what we have on the vertical axis is percentage of the vote that went to Republicans in 2022, right? And we have this line right here, this diagonal line, okay, y equals x. So what this line represents, any dot that's on this line, it means that support for Republicans did not change. Okay, whatever it was in 2022, that's the same thing it was the previous time that state had a Senate election. Okay. Any dot that's above the line, okay, that represents a state where support for Republicans increased. Any dot that's below the line represents a state where support for Republicans decreased. Okay, and we see, just as we see with these pink highlights here, that most of the dots are above the line, right? It even kind of looks like this wave lifting over the line. So again, it suggests to us that there was a hidden red wave. Okay, now another way we could look at this is say, okay, well, sure, yeah, there's a lot more states where support increased versus decreased, right? We see that by the numbers, we can see the average, we see it in this chart here in terms of where the dots are. But what if that happens by chance? Okay, if you have a random process, right, there is a certain probability that by chance, right, a bunch of the results will end up on one side of the line versus the other, right? And not every state is listed here, right? Only approximately one third of the states voted, right? So we're not representing the whole country here. So what if this is by chance? Okay, and there's a statistical tool to look at that, okay, and that's called the paired sample t-test. Okay, I'm not going to explain in this video how the paired sample t-test works. I actually have a separate video on that, and I'll link that in the description, but I'll show you the result. Okay, what this test does is it looks at the difference between two different groups, and the groups are paired in a certain way. So for example, our two groups is actually the same group of states with the results before and after. So the most recent election and the election that happened before that, right? And you're looking at the difference, right? And what the paired sample t-test returns is something called the p-value. Okay, now the p-value is the probability of observing the difference that you see, or an even bigger difference, assuming that the two populations are actually the same. Okay, so let's say that if you were able to poll every single state, right, and you were able to know exactly how much support for Republicans increased, and let's say that increase is actually 0. Okay, well, if you take a sample of only some of those states and you look at the difference, well, chances are you're not going to get 0, right? But you might get something close to 0, right? That's reasonable if the true difference is 0, right? So given the differences that we observe, okay, given the data that we observe, not just what the average difference is, but how widespread the data is, how much data points do we have? So given all that, we're asked, okay, what's the probability of observing what we're observing, of observing the kind of difference that we see, or an even greater difference, assuming that the true difference is 0, okay? And the p-value that we get is 0.2. That's in percentage, okay? So that's 0.2%, okay? So assuming that there wasn't a statistically significant increase in support for Republicans, the probability of seeing the kind of difference that we're seeing is 0.2%, which is very, very unlikely, okay? Which tells us that our assumption of there not being a significant increase in support for Republicans, that assumption is probably incorrect, okay? Because if that assumption is correct, the chances of seeing the kind of differences that we're seeing is only 0.2%, right? So that paired sample t-test also tells us that, yes, there was a statistically significant increase in support for Republicans, okay? Now, there's these two outliers here that I want to mention, okay? These two dots that are way above the line. And these two states, okay, you see this one, it was 0% support for Republicans, and then it jumped to 40% in 2022. This one, it was somewhere in the mid-50s support for Republicans, and then it jumped to over 80% in 2022. Okay, so those two states are Alaska and California. Okay, and the reason they're kind of outliers here with these strange numbers is that in California, the last time they had an election before 2022, there was no Republican candidate. That's where that 0 comes from. In 2022, there was a candidate who got 40.1% of the vote, which is, of course, an increase of 40.1%, very large increase. In Alaska, you actually had a different situation where in the election before 2022, you had a Republican candidate with about 54% of the vote. And in 2022, the competition was actually between two Republican candidates without a Democratic candidate there, right? So combining support for both of those Republican candidates, you have 87%, and those were the two leading candidates. So of course that's a big jump, right? But you could say, okay, those are outliers, right? You can see based on the data that they're outliers. There's a certain kind of unique situation there where you either had a Republican candidate missing or you have a Democratic candidate missing. On the other hand, you could argue, well, no, they're not outliers because that's part of the same trend, right? If you have a increase in support for Republicans, yeah, going from no Republican candidate to the existence of one that gets about 40% of the vote, that fits the trend, right? Going from one Republican candidate to two Republican candidates who are leading ahead of everyone else, that goes with the trend. So you can debate are these outliers or not, okay? But we can actually remove these outliers and see what happens, okay? So here we've removed the data for Alaska and California. Okay, the data that remains, we see that, well, it's still mostly red, right? So out of 32 states now, instead of 34, because we removed 2 of them, 25 of them have an increase in Republican support, 7 have a decrease, 78% have an increase in Republican support, about 22% have a decrease. So the trend still remains. On average, okay, the increase in Republican support or the change in support for Republicans is a positive 2.8, so approximately 3%. It is lower than 4.8, right, because we removed these 2 high Republican support increase outliers. Okay, so 2.8%, it might seem like a small number, but remember this is an average. So approximately half of the data, especially since we've removed outliers, approximately half of the data is above 2.8, okay, which means more than an increase of more than 2.8% for Republicans. And if you look at the numbers here, where it's red, it's quite high, right? 6.7%, 3, 7.6, 3.4, 8, 4.47. And if you look where it's not red, where the Republicans lost support, the numbers aren't so big, right? Negative 2.7, negative 0.7, negative 2.3, generally speaking, right? There are, of course, exceptions, right? Like here, the Republicans lost a lot, right? Negative 8 almost, right? Here, the Republicans gained, but just a little bit, 0.14. But generally speaking, we still see that large increase in Republican support, okay? And of course, this chart looks the same with most of the red dots being above that diagonal black line. When we look at the p-value, interestingly enough, it goes from 0.2% to 0.02%. Okay, so removing these strong pro-Republican outliers actually makes our p-value go down, makes it even less likely that these results are based on chance, right? So again, that p-value means that assuming that there was not a statistically significant increase for Republican support, what are the chances of observing the difference that we're observing? Well, that probability actually becomes lower by a factor of 10 approximately, right? 0.02%. The reason it becomes lower is because when we have these 2 outliers, they add a lot to the variation in the data. If you look at the standard deviation, it's 9. That represents how widespread the data is. Without those outliers, the standard deviation drops from 9 to 4, right? So how this contributes to that paired sample t-test is it's an indicator that you don't have as much variation in the data. Okay, and if you don't have as much variation in the data, then whatever trend you do see, that trend is less likely to be as a result of variation and more likely to be as a result of some statistically significant phenomena. Okay, so when you have large variation like this, right, like these 2 outliers, well then who knows, maybe this phenomena that causes large variation in the data contributed to these data points as well. So we can't trust this trend so much. If we remove the outliers, we don't have so much variation, right? So whatever trend we see here, less likely as a result of random variation and more likely some trend going on. So we actually see that smaller p-value, which is actually ironically removing, from the perspective of the paired sample t-test, removing the strong pro-Republican outliers actually makes it seem even more like we have that hidden red wave. Okay? And then the final question becomes, okay, so if we see such an increase in support for Republicans, how come they didn't win any seats? Right? And that goes back to, well, what does it mean for us to have a hidden red wave, right? The examples that we did before, right? If support from Republicans goes from 20% to 45%, in some state, well, they still lost, right? They still wouldn't win that seat, right? If support for Republicans goes from 55% to 80%, well, again, that doesn't change what happens to the seat. They were winning it before, they're still winning it now, right? So then the question is, okay, well, why was it only hidden? Okay, if we look at this chart, right, if we see increase in support for Republicans where they didn't do as well in the previous election before 2022, we see an increase in support for Republicans where they did do well before 2022. Well, then how come we don't see, how come it doesn't work in the middle, right? In the states where it was about 50-50, how come an increase in support didn't happen there to push the Republicans ahead? Well, let's look at that part of this chart. Okay, so this is between 40 and 50 right here. So horizontally between 40 and 50, this is where before 2022, okay, and whatever election happened before 2022 for the Senate, in those states, Republicans had a support level in the 40s, right? So they were close to gaining a seat, okay? And what we see in this range is, look at this, 1, 2, 3 data points below the black line. Yeah, there's a lot of data points above the black line too, but there's a lot of data points above the black line everywhere. Okay, but what makes this range 40 to 50 stand out? You have 3 data points below the black line. You don't have that anywhere else. Okay, 20 to 30, you have 1 data point below the black line. 60 to 70, you have 2 data points below the black line. I mean, maybe you can count this one, but it's also kind of on the line. This one's sort of on the line too, right? So you can throw in the 60 to 70% range in there if you want, but even if you include it in there, still this has this strange phenomenon where you have these points below the black line more than in most other ranges, okay? And if you're wondering what those states are, that's what I have highlighted here. So that was Arizona, Colorado, and Georgia. Again, this is before the Georgia runoff election. Okay, and depending on when you're watching these videos, these numbers for 2022 might have changed a little bit, okay, because counting was still ongoing in some places when I made this video. Okay, so that's noteworthy, right? So you see a general increase in support for Republicans pretty much everywhere, but in that range where it really counts, where Republicans really needed to gain support in order to win more seats, they actually lost support in 3 states, which is unusual looking at the other states on the board, right? So that's noteworthy. Yeah, they gained support in a number of states too, but even where they gained support, they're still states below 50, right? They didn't gain too much support. Right? And even look at how far above the black line these red dots are. Here they're quite a bit above the black line, and here you see a little bit of a dip, a little bit more of a concentration close to the black line, right? So it looks like despite having a general increase in support, Republicans didn't see as good results right where it counts between 40 and 50%. So that explains why, despite this hidden red wave, it didn't result in more seats being gained, okay? Which is why the red wave is hidden. Otherwise, it would not be hidden, right? If you saw substantial seat gains for the Republicans. Now, the data doesn't explain why they actually lost support in 3 states, didn't gain as much support where they did gain in the states in that 40 to 50% range, right? You can call it the swing state range. The other states in this box here, in this range here where Republicans had 40 to 50% before 2022. If you're curious, that's Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Washington, Wisconsin. Okay, and the ones where they lost support, again, Arizona, Colorado, Georgia. Okay, so the data doesn't show why the red wave didn't materialize as strongly for those states. It just shows that it didn't materialize as strongly, but it's not surprising that the data for these states is a little bit different, because if you're going to be forming an election strategy, your strategy is going to be different, whatever party you are, right? Your strategy is going to be different specifically for the swing states. right? Because those are the states where you really, really want to gain support and not lose support. So if both parties had a different strategy, a different approach to those states, it's not surprising that you see different results for those states than you would see somewhere else. So that's what the data shows. It looks like there was a hidden red wave, but it's hidden, right? It's not where it was needed for the Republicans to gain seats. And that's that. So I hope you enjoyed that video, found it interesting, and I'll see you next time.